Hi, I'm Marit Higraff from Death in Isdalen Valley, and I am this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Okay, so here we are, third episode in, and we get to our first, what the genre labelist folk would call a true crime podcast. We're supposed to insert some dramatic music in here, but nothing would compete with the soundtrack and sound effects on Death in Isdal Valley.
Very true, Dr. Watson. It's interesting. Those elements are an intrinsic part of the podcast, adding a rather dramatic, immersive layer to the listening experience.
You'll hear me and Sherlock here talking about sound with our guest in this episode of MetaPod coming up in a few minutes. So, Death in Isdal Valley was a 2019 co-production by the BBC and NRK, the public broadcasters here in the UK and in Norway, respectively.
Journalist Marit Higraff was one of the hosts of the 11-episode podcast alongside her counterpart from the BBC, Neil McCarthy. Now, Kev, you had some confessions to make in the first 2 episodes of MetaPod, so here's one from me. You recommended Death in Isdal Valley to me last summer, repeatedly. And I didn't want to listen to it.
Really? Why was that? I mean, in the end, you did, right?
Well, before falling asleep, which is when I was listening to podcasts, it just didn't really seem like a good time for the D word, death.
Now, I imagine you kind of clutching a teddy bear, gnashing your teeth with fear, hiding under your duvet as you listened to this podcast, right? Or am I just trying to add some feeble drama of my own into our introduction here?
Yeah, that appears to be what you're doing, drama, Kev. And for the record, I don't own a teddy bear.
Okay.
The reality was I ended up listening to Death in Isdal Valley during a weekend walk, and wow, the opening music just completely blew me away. And from there, 11 episodes were consumed like cake. And cookies, which I really like.
So from death to cookies, it sounds like a new goth pop band. But anyway, right. So Marit Higraff joined us from her home in Oslo late last year to tell us all about Death in Isdal Valley. We cover everything from the aforementioned soundtrack to how her and Neil waded through a deluge of tips from listeners, amateur sleuths, if you will.
We also get into our first discussion on MetaPod about the role of DNA and genetic databases in solving crime cases. I say first because we've got another true crime episode of MetaPod coming up. That show tackles some of the same issues around DNA and identity, but with a very different approach and outcome.
Now, let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. Let's take listeners instead to a small town in Norway called Bergen and the mysterious story and investigation of the Isdal Woman.
We're supposed to insert heavy rain and dramatic ambient synthscape here, right?
We could, but better leave the quality soundscape production to Death in Isdal Valley.
All right, start the tape.
A very warm welcome, Marit Higraff, for joining us on MetaPod for this week's episode. We're really delighted that you could spend some time with us to tell us about Death in Isdal Valley, which is the NRK and BBC podcast. Now, I think it would be useful for listeners of MetaPod to start at the beginning almost and give us your kind of sense on who is the Isdal Woman from what you know, and what do you think the podcast did to look into her story?
First of all, the Isdal Woman is a given name to body of a woman found dead end of November 1970, exactly 50 years ago soon. Mm-hmm. So this woman was found severely burned. The police immediately started a full investigation into this case. Everything seemed like a murder case. Around the body, objects were laid, almost ceremonial, and no traces of an identification was found. It wasn't possible for them to find her identity, and it has remained like that for these 50 years. And this mysterious woman, without a name, without an identity, is still a mystery.
Yeah. And the purpose of the podcast, when you and Neil McCarthy, who we must mention probably quite a lot because he is your collaborator on Death in Ice Valley. When you first started thinking about the idea, I mean, obviously you'd been on the case, as it were, for some time before the podcast came about. But what was it that you decided that, okay, now we're going to turn our investigation at NRK into something that's collaborative with something like the BBC? And what were the aims of that? What was your thinking?
Well, we didn't decide that, actually. We didn't go to the BBC. The BBC came to us, and it was quite amazing, actually, because I'm an investigative journalist, yes? Me and my team started this investigation into this incredible, mysterious case in 2016. And we published a lot of stories in an web-based project, video, podcast, online stories, but in Norwegian. So to us, it was a great surprise when suddenly foreign journalists started to contact us, saying, wow, we would love to cover your story, your project. May I come to Norway? Could you fill me in? May I interview you? Wow, amazing! Yes. How did you learn about it? And then we realized through, Reddit, places like that people used Google Translate to turn Norwegian into English and to understand what we were all about. And they had really problems with the video project, of course, where I'm speaking, because it's not that easy to use Google Translate on a video. The one led to another, and a BBC World Service journalist, online journalist, contacted us and said she wants to come to Norway and cover our project and story. She came, she made her stories, and we were not prepared. This story, online story of hers, this really reached worldwide. As far as I know, is one of the BBC World Service's most read stories ever. That story was also read by the BBC World Service podcast editor. So one day he called and he said, this is amazing. This is an amazing story. We want to collaborate. Can we please make a podcast together? And we said, yeah, we'll help you. Of course, come here. Again, one led to the other. Next minute, 3 tooth-dressed men from BBC in London came to Oslo and they said, we want you as a host. And I said, what? And I said, no. But this podcast editor, John Manell is his name, he's a stubborn guy. So he said, again, why? No. Of course you can do it. No, my English is too bad. I said, no, I cannot do it. We'll help you with your podcast. No, you're going to do it. And yeah, that was the beginning of Death in Ice Valley. And I said yes.
Curious, as we start to kind of look into the background of how it all started. I mean, did you have a specific goal in mind? Because in some respects, when you listen to Death in Ice Valley over the course of the 10, 11 episodes, it's a story. It's a very linear story. Did you kind of plan it out that way, or did a lot of it evolve as you went along and you discovered things and you spoke to more people and more evidence came your way? Or did you have a lot of it already kind of planned out?
Well, as I say, we had been working on this investigation with the research for quite a long time when BBC came along and we made this podcast. So the research and the founding, some of it was already there. So it was, for the podcast, it was a matter of planning the episodes, what to put in where, and how to do the storytelling. And I would say collaboration between us in NRK and the BBC is that we had the journalism and the research. It was already done, the investigation, most of it, a lot of it. It was also going on when we produced the podcast, yes, but a lot of it was done. And the BBC's contribution is the storytelling and how the podcast is produced by the brilliant Neil McCarthy.
Yeah.
So you said that you were working on the case since 2016. Was that correct? And BBC came along about when? 2018? Or
1 year later, 2017.
17?
Yeah,
Okay. And I mean, for you as an investigative journalist, was it difficult to take a switch to that storytelling mode?
Well, I'm used to storytelling. It's kind of my profession too, but I'm actually normally a TV journalist. That's where I do my storytelling. This is actually my first podcast and my first experience with radio. So it was kind of easy for me in this project to let the radio documentary guy, Neil, take care of the storytelling, because he's really brilliant and I had more than enough to keep track, of the facts and the investigative part. Of course, we worked together on the manuscripts, but the storytelling is really the genius, Neil McCarthy, that has the main responsibility.
What did you learn from Neil? Did he ask you to do things that were new for you as a journalist?
Well, I think, I learned everything I know about radio and podcast. No, that's a bit wrong. I have done some radio before, but I haven't done a podcast before. And as a matter of fact, I'm telling you a secret now. Neil hadn't either. None of us made a podcast before.
Well, you fooled us.
So we found each other there. Well, did you make a podcast before? No.
No. It's great.
Let's make a podcast.
Did you have fun with that, or was it difficult at moments, or were you just, excited to learn together and to try stuff?
It was exciting and we had fun, and most of all, I think we were eager to make our own way, and we stuck to that. We made our own way. It's important to say that was from the very beginning of very important to us, to take the listeners with us out in the field, to give the listeners listening experience, not just rambling on, giving them facts. Early on, we agreed, me and Neil, about that we've heard way too many podcasts where 2 or 3 or more people are sitting in a studio and just blah, 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 talking. And both of us were bored by that. So we early on agreed that let's make this into something more, something a really treat for the ears. So we wanted to make it as less studio-based as possible. We wanted to go out in the field with our microphones to touch the environment. And I think that's very much a base for this project, that what you hear is it's much more. Of course, we had to go into studio sometimes, and you can hear that. We had to bind the different scenes together. So we were in London every now and then and finished the episodes when we had to, make something in studio. But we also in studio, we tried to be as less script-based as possible. At location, never a script. We tried to never use a script, just, be free, just to speak, just to not this, harsh news journalist way reading from a manuscript. So that was important to us, and we did this throughout. But of course, we have scripts in studios sometimes, but we weren't always true to the scripts.
I think what's so interesting, and this is, I think, is related, is, as you say, you're a TV investigative journalist, and it was Neil's first, as you've now admitted for the first time, it was also, the first podcast there. I mean, when you listen to Death in Isdal Valley, the soundtrack and the sound effects, if there were any, just create a different kind of, because there's nothing visual to look at. It's only when you start looking around on the internet that you might see pictures of where the body was found and things like that. So from a sonic perspective, that's a really difficult thing to do. And that's what's so, I think, powerful about the podcast, is that you get a real sense of a lot of the locations and the feel of the when you're walking up to the place where she was found, you understand it a little bit more because there's that relentless rain noise and all that kind of stuff. So I just thought that was a really impressive way of transferring something that was not able to look at into something that people listen to.
I'm really happy you're saying that. I mean, when you work with radio, you have to try to create the pictures. It was a new way to work for me, As a TV journalist, I'm used to I have my photographer here, and we show the people what we're speaking about. But you have to create the scenes and the picture and try to describe for the people, for the listeners, where you are, how it is, what it looks like, and to give them a climate, an entrance to the scenes where you are. So it was, it was exciting for me, this.
About the rain, I'm curious if Norwegians have the same feeling about the rain in the soundtrack as other people who are not living in Norway.
I'm not sure if I can answer that question. I've got a lot of reactions about the rain, of course, on Twitter and everywhere else, and I get a lot of response from the audience. Bergen, the city where this woman was found at 50 years ago, is a city on the western coast of Norway, and it's a city where it rains a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. We have different climates in Norway. Here in Oslo, we have a much more dry climate. On the west coast of Norway, it's a lot of rain. We started out there in Bergen, going to the scene, the place where she was found. And Neil arrived in Bergen on a Sunday evening, and the schedule which I had made was it was such a schedule with meetings with different interviewees and so. And we started out very early on Monday morning, and on that Monday morning, it started to rain, and rain, and rain, and I can't tell you, it was such rain. We were out there the whole day on the scene in Isdalen where she was found, and I was so wet and cold when we came back. And then you start listening to the recordings you have made, the interviews and the scenes we have made, and the rain is there. It's a huge problem. Yes, you can hear it. You can, because sometimes we used umbrellas, sometimes not, but you can hear it on the umbrellas. You can hear rain everywhere, and then continued like this. It was raining the whole week with recordings. There's so much that I think Neil got a shock with his first experience with Norway.
So this is all just broken trees, chopped down forest. There's trunks, logs, branches broken up in the path, which is completely sodden. There's been a lot of rain already, and more rain coming in this valley on the outskirts of the wettest of Norwegian towns. Yeah.
Welcome to Norway.
Ah?
Welcome to Norway.
Yeah, nice weather you have here.
It's a nice stroll in Norwegian woods.
But we came home with the recordings, and it was rain all over the place. And I think this is a good example of how to turn a problem into an advantage, because rain was there. We couldn't do anything about it. Everything we had recorded was sort of soaked in rain, and then doesn't sound too bad, and we couldn't take it away. We had to stick with this rain, and that got sort of a mark for our podcast.
I mean, one of the artifacts that you talk about is this rain boot that was found at the site where the woman was found. And just to get into some of the details of the story, was there a favorite item in this story for you that was part of the case, or that maybe doesn't appear in the podcast? You know, there's a spoon, there's a bag, there's quite a few things, a suitcase and some wigs, some interesting things.
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting things. And I tell you what, I would have loved to see those things, because that is something that I'm very sorry about, is that the police didn't keep the things. One thing that we discovered quite early on was that there's nothing left. Nothing is left after this woman, because the police managed to find 2 suitcases at the train station in Bergen after her death, and they found out this belongs to this woman. And these 2 suitcases were stuffed with, there were wigs, there were cosmetics, a lot of sophisticated clothes. I would have loved to see that, but nothing is kept from these things. The only original item from this woman, the only original item that we have managed to find, because I have really searched for the suitcases. Are they placed in a basement somewhere that somebody has, I
Some
never know
retired
if
police officer might have them, yeah.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, they have their storage rooms in Bergen, and I have called. I think the police in Bergen are very...
They know you.
Tired of me. They know me. Yeah. It's me again. These suitcases. Things like that.
Was there a special item that you read a description of that really stood out to you, even though you couldn't see it?
I would say that the only original item left by this woman that is kept, or that we have found, is maybe the most interesting one. And that is this code sheet, which she wrote. The original is preserved. It is now by the State's Archive in Bergen, and I have studied this a lot without finding the real truth. But it's written by her. It's her handwriting, and yeah.
During the course of creating this podcast, were there any moments, whether it was dealing with evidence or talking to experts, that you felt you were on the verge of a really big breakthrough in the case?
Yes, I have had that feeling sometimes, actually, not just once. One of those moments is in the podcast. I don't want to give away too much for those who wants to listen themselves and don't know the podcast, but for 50 years, one of the main theories about this woman has been that she was a spy, some kind of agent for a country, for someone. And during the work with the podcast, I managed to find a person who had a story to tell where, I really had the goosebumps when she told that story. This old lady, I don't want to give away too much, but when she told her story, I, for the first time, really was convinced. Wow, this is it. This woman was some kind of agent.
Where does this story of the Isdal woman fit in Norwegian culture? And has that changed over time? I mean, is it something would they learn about this in school now? Or is it considered a sort of folk tale or a conspiracy theory? And how is that different than maybe you've seen it interpreted in other countries?
The story about the Isdal woman, or the finding of the Isdal woman, is a big and very important story in Bergen, on the west coast of Norway, where she was found. It's kind of a myth there, where that's something that people still discuss and have discussed for 50 years. It wasn't very well known all over Norway before. Of course, it has been every now and then. It has been in the papers. It has been on telly. But for the last years, it is very well known all over Norway, as it also is in many places abroad. First of all, it's a Bergen story. It's the people in Bergen. They say it's part of Bergen's identity, the Isdal Woman story, the mystery.
Are Norwegians involved in the crowdsourcing that has been such a big part of the podcast, or is it mostly people from elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, we have this Facebook group connected to our podcast. We invite the listeners in to join our investigation to help us. That was important to me and us in NRK as well, because we have known for a long time that the answer is not in Norway. This we know for sure. This woman was not a Norwegian. She was a foreigner. And the answer, that's somebody or those who maybe know something about her identity, they are somewhere abroad. So to us, it has been important the whole time to bring this story out to a broader audience, and has been my hope for a long time to get that phone call or that email back.
Is that an idea that you started with, or, that you had back in 2016, that in order to take this case further needs to go international?
We in NRK let me put it this way, we in NRK were from the beginning of positive to the journalists, and so that made contact with us and wanted to make a story about our project, because we have known the whole time that it's important to us to this story out there. Maybe there are some people out there that somebody knows something, But the BBC wanted to introduce, they wanted to use Facebook and to make an interaction with the audience. And yeah, it was also perfect. I mean, it's also about spreading the word and to get an interaction with audience that maybe somewhere knows something.
Many times during the podcast, you and Neil mention the Facebook group, and you're always thanking people for, you've created this group of amateur detectives almost, and you're always thanking people for sending in information. How did you kind of filter that information to decide on which were the tips that you should investigate more and which ones were just, conspiracy theorists sitting at home coming up with an idea?
Well, this having an interaction with the audience, like we've had with this Facebook group, has really been a very interesting experience to me and to us as journalists. I mean, normally we as journalists, we investigate and we produce our stories and we publish them when the investigation is finished, right? That is the normal way of doing things. So this was, It was quite an experience and something totally new to turn your mind on. Are we going to produce and publish before we are finished, before we have the answers? Yeah, we are. That's kind of a nerve thing to do, And then we had this Facebook group when we had the first episodes, and this Facebook group was launched. I tell you, I didn't sleep at night. Yeah, I did, but I was so nervous. I read through everything, and there was an enormous amount of posts. People were so active, and I thought, my God, I have worked with this project for a couple of years now, and they will have the solution. When I wake up tomorrow morning, they will have copies. God. And yeah, that was the first weeks in a way. I was, tomorrow morning I'm going to read who she was. More relaxed with the thing now. And as a matter of fact, I have good cooperation with some of the people who have been active on the Facebook group, really doing amazing amateur sleuthing. And they have contacted me and we have good collaboration about things. It has been a really interesting, experience.
I'm very curious, without, as you said earlier, without giving away too much of the actual story, but there are a number of times where you come to a point in the story where official sources or official information seems to stop, or you're not allowed to see certain things, or even the very, very beginning where the police investigation was case closed very, very quickly within a number of weeks. And I wonder how that has affected your thinking about the institutions that you are reporting on. You know, you're a Norwegian. These are part of the state apparatus. How do you feel now about those institutions that you've come across these parts of the story that I think are quite frustrating, because you're so close almost, but you're not quite there because a barrier has come down?
Yeah, it is maybe not a surprise that it's difficult to try to work with secret services. They are sort of secret in their way. So we have to be thankful that we, as the first journalists ever, we got the file on the Isdal Woman by the secret police in Norway. A lot of journalists and writers and a lot of people have tried to solve this case for 50 years. And a lot of journalists have suspected there is a file on her, and we managed to see the file and to read through it. The disappointment was that the file actually contained that little. When you go discover, they really do have a file, and you're supposed to see it. You go in there, it's like going to religious ceremony. You're really expecting everything, and you get in there, you read through it, and there isn't actually anything. There's too little. You go out from there and you have the feeling, what did I read now? The feeling that something is not there that should have been there, the feeling that you didn't get to see it all, the feeling that you got to see a part of the file that was given to you. And so that's kind of disappointing. I mean, 50 years have gone, and I have the feeling that still somebody covers up something in this case for some reason or another. I'm still hoping I haven't given up, solving this mystery. It's no secret that we haven't. For those of you who haven't listened to the podcast yet and wants to listen, we didn't manage to solve it yet. We have managed to get, I would say, quite a lot of new answers. We have come a long way. We know a lot more about this woman than that was known from before. So, but I still haven't given up, finding these answers, what we're searching for. Who was she? Her identity? What was she doing in Norway? Why did she die in that isolated valley outside Bergen? What was her mission? And I think everything starts with the identity. Who was she? And that's what we try to find out. So I'm still hoping that there are some files in somewhere that we will be giving access to, or maybe the answer or riddle will be solved more easily by her DNA. We are waiting for police will open up. We hope so, that they will open up here in Norway to the possibility for using her DNA in further investigations.
It sounds like you have faith in discovering some documents still that might lead you to a new conclusion. That's what I was hearing, that you think there are some documents somewhere still that might have some clues.
I am still searching, yes, for documents and for clues. And as a matter of fact, I every now and then through these years spent on this project, something comes up. People are making contact. Somebody found something in the basement, left by their uncle or something. And so it could be a document, but to be realistic, I think if we're going to solve this case, and I have to believe it is a case that I have realized it's the case of my life. I will never get rid of it, I guess. So I have to believe we are going to solve it one day, and the solution is maybe more realistic, that we are going to solve it through tissue samples that we actually found left in a hospital in Bergen.
What would you say is the reason why this case is so compelling to both people in Bergen, where you say it's, it is almost folklore in Bergen, but to the now thousands, millions of people that have listened to the podcast? What is it that makes people so drawn to the story of the Isdal Woman?
Well, it's a hype of true crime out there at the moment. It has been like this for years, yes. And this story has everything in it. It's riddle upon riddle. This woman found dead, severely burnt. All the labels had been cut off her clothes, cut off her items, obviously to hide the origin, and police didn't manage to find her true identity. And still, after 50 years, nobody managed to find her true identity. And so she or someone did a very thorough job to hide her true identity. And then you have this layer upon that we're talking 1970 here. We're in the depth of the Cold War. I mean, Europe was something completely different back then, as we grown-ups know, and the younger generation may learn about. It was a time where Europe was divided in two places, and we had the Iron Curtain, and we had spies. I mean, a lot of them. Things were going on in my country, in Norway. I grew up in the northern part of Norway, and it was totally normal to hear about submarines, Russian submarines, sneaking around in our fjords and things like that. I remember I was scared to hell about weapons, atomic bombs. We had spies in Norway. Norway has a border to Russia, and it was interesting for several countries to send their agents here to take a closer look at an important NATO member, I would say. So, because of our border to Russia. So it was a completely different era. And that gives another layer to the story of the Isdal Woman, and gives this, well, it may be, I'm open to everything. It may be that she was just an ordinary housewife from Essex in England, or from I know, Dresden in Germany. For that time, 1970, we know that she traveled a lot by airplane. It was expensive back then. Not everybody could afford that, and not everybody did that. My parents didn't travel anywhere in 1970. We went 2 hours to the Sweden border. That was our holiday. So, and we had a camping. It wasn't that usual to travel that much. And remember, this was a woman traveling by herself a lot. And that makes another layer to this. Who was this woman, and what was her mission?
I think that's what's, for me, is so compelling about it, is those elements. As soon as you kind of add espionage into it, it just becomes instantly more interesting that there is some kind of goings on between governments against other governments, as you say, maybe spying on the Soviets. And I think the thing that really struck me towards the end of listening to Death in Isdal Valley is she was clearly an important person, I think. I don't think she was kind of a lower level in the espionage world. I suspect she was probably more important than perhaps we give her credit for, because of the cover-up. I just don't think that governments or secret services would have gone to the lengths that they have to keep it secret if she wasn't an important part of what was going on.
Well, we don't know that anybody did something to cover anything up, but we assume that somebody knows something also here in Norway. And it is strange, as you said early on, and as we say in the podcast, it is indeed very strange with the police investigation into such a mysterious finding, a dead body, severely burned, a lot of objects, no identity. obviously a foreigner. And the investigation is then abruptly shut down after 3 weeks.
Yeah.
That is nothing. 3 weeks investigation into the case back in 1970. And then they went home for Christmas holiday and they didn't investigate anything more. And that is one of the strangest things to me. And also the, press, if you see the footage from the press conference back then, when they closed the investigation down, they are, it's the way you just get the feeling that now no further questions, not more to see, just pass on. You get this this feeling that they know more than they say. So maybe we'll know one day.
Do you think that the crowdsourcing that you've done as part of this podcast is now an essential element of any podcast in the true crime genre now?
You mean if the others are doing it, or if I mean it's essential?
Do you think it's an essential element of a podcast, having that social media community and engagement?
Well, I think I would like to answer that question more in general. I think that we, as journalists and we as a public broadcaster, the future could be and maybe should be much more interaction with our audience. It's definitely something we could be better in. To interact both ways, not just telling the audience how the world looks like from Oslo or London, So I think that has been really interesting too, and for the people who make podcasts like we did in the true crime genre, I think it could be very positive to be open to the audience, to be open to the listeners, and invite them in to join the investigation.
How could the listeners of this podcast help you?
Well, we still have this Facebook group, Death in Isdalen Valley, on Facebook, and it's still very active. There are a lot of amateur sleuths in there, and they have a lot of discussions going on. So if you're really into true crime and you want to listen to our project and story about the Isdal Woman, then you can join the Facebook group and join the discussion.
I have one final question from me. What is the status of the podcast now? So the final episode was the live episode you did in Bergen with the audience and some panel members. You talked there about there was a case coming up that you were going to be looking at, but that's a year and a half ago now, 18 months ago. What is the future for the Death in Isdal Valley podcast, if there is one, or are you just going to leave it to the amateur sleuths of Facebook to solve the case for you?
To be honest, I haven't given up solving the case, and earlier on I called it a case of my life, and I think it is. It's going to follow me. I work with other things now, I have to say, but I still have this my sort of side project, and I keep an eye on everything, and I get contacted by people all the time, people with clues and leads and tips. So it's always worth listening to what people have to tell. So I still think there is a possibility to solve this, and I'm aiming for it. And we have told the listeners that we will come back if and when we have something of really importance to tell. And so we never know when that will be or when we have new episodes coming up. But I'm still hoping for it and aiming for it.
So we're not expecting a feature-length film or anything of Death in Isdal Valley?
Let me put it this way. There is a lot of interest in the story and the project. There is a lot of interests. There are a lot of interesting businesses getting in touch with us. Yeah.
Well, that's great to hear. Thank you so much for joining us, Marit, here on MetaPod.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
So I think we've managed to strike a good balance there by not giving away too much of the story of the Isdal Woman for those who haven't listened to Death in Ice Valley yet, but also sharing some fascinating bits about the podcast and how it came together.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we really want to do with MetaPod, both, I guess, teeing up what we believe are some of the best shows around, but also getting the backstories on them. As you said before, Wendy, I went on and on and on and on about Death in Ice Valley to you. So I'm glad my persistence finally paid off. And more importantly, Marit was happy to come to our show and talk about it.
Now, as I said in the intro, we return to the subject of DNA databases in a future episode of MetaPod. We interview the host of another brilliant true crime podcast focused on a now famous case from my home state, New Hampshire, in the US. Some of you will be able to guess which podcast this is, but for now we'll keep it under wraps.
Stay tuned, as we say. I suspect listeners will breathe a huge sigh of relief when I say we'll probably have to take our discussion of goth pop band names based on cookies and death to our virtual green room.
Perhaps a wise decision, Dr. Watson. I still think there's some listeners who'll want to know more about From Death to Cookies. But in the meantime, go and listen to Death in Ice Valley. It's easy to find by going to the BBC World Service website and enjoy the sound of that relentless rain in Bergen, Norway.
We'll also post some links on the article for this episode on metapodshow.com to make it even easier for you.
Huge thanks to Marit for joining us for this episode, and we wish her all the best as she continues the investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you enjoyed this episode of MetaPod, give us a review and a rating wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks for listening again.
And we'll see you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.